Hello, welcome to Not in My Front Yard, Green Street Rain Gardens, Aesthetics and Social Values with Eliza Pennypacker and Kate Cholakis. Eliza is going to speak first, and then Kate is going to take it away um, to tell you more about these two accomplished women. Eliza Pennypacker is a professor of landscape architecture at Penn State University. Since 2005, she has conducted research with Stuart Eccles on artful rainwater design, ARD, sustainable stormwater management that celebrates the rain in a way that is entertaining and enlightening. She and Eccles have presented and published extensively on the subject, including their 2015 book, Artful Rainwater Design, Creative Ways to Manage Stormwater. Pennypacker is a passionate teacher committed to inculcating independent design decision-making in her students. Kate Cholakis teaches ecological design and planning within the Conway School's graduate program, and her professional practice involves green infrastructure planning and design and ecological approaches to land management. She's currently conducting research examining the intersections of sustainable stormwater management, landscape perception, and environmental behavior. Kate earned her BA in architecture from Smith College, her MA from the Conway School, and MSLA from Penn State University. She is a lead green associate. With that, we will turn it over to Eliza and then Kate.
Thank you, Chris. And hi, everybody. Welcome, attendees. It's an honor to be here, and we're delighted that you've chosen to attend this presentation. I'm the warm-up act. Most of this presentation is going to be in Kate's very capable hands. So why in the world would I begin by showing you an ancient document, a publication that I did way back in 1992? Well, because my interest in this topic began for me about 30 years ago when I undertook a sabbatical study on what I perceived as a problem. And that problem was the disconnect between the look of the landscape that the American middle class appreciates, which I will characterize as the clipped and tidy, versus new frontiers in aesthetics that landscape architects were advocating in the early 90s. At the time, we were calling it ecological aesthetic and the aesthetic avant-garde. And what I learned in my sabbatical study was really important. It's that the American middle class preference for the neat and tidy landscape actually isn't about aesthetics at all. It's about a way to proclaim some very, very deep-seated American values. So, next slide, please. While landscape architects were asking this, I thought otherwise, and I suggested it in the article that I wrote for the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. Next slide, please. A little tidbit. If we wish to function as cultural gadflies, forever buzzing on the fringe, we may simply promote the virtues of non-traditional landscape aesthetics and sneer at the hopelessly laggard middle-class taste. Well, I hope it's obvious by the tone of that little quote that in 1992, frankly, I was suggesting that this attitude wasn't going to get us very far. In fact, if we want to move the needle of landscape design that the American public can appreciate and embrace, we have to do it in very smart ways to shift people to environmentally responsible design. So for 30 years, I've been focused on trying to answer the following question. Next slide, please. How can we create environmentally responsible design that the public finds pleasing? Because we will only really make a difference in the American landscape if the public embraces what we are trying to do. So pretty soon after, next slide, please, my research was directed toward a subset of that big question that's been my focus ever since. As Chris mentioned, artful rainwater design, or ARD, environmentally responsible rainwater management that visibly celebrates rain. You can see what the rain is doing. Next slide, please. My research colleagues Stuart Eccles and I are really jazzed about ARD because it accomplishes so many things, as the next text will explain. We're responding to regulatory demands. We're managing runoff in responsible ways. We're recognizing rainwater as a resource. But to me, the best part is that we can transform people's perception of rainwater from a waste product to a very precious resource. This is how I believe we move the needle. And so, next slide. In 2015, as Chris mentioned, we published this book, and we were honored to speak in 2017 at the Ecological Landscape Alliance in Massachusetts. And that was where I met Kate. Kate, my co-presenter, she was in that audience. And she has graciously claimed that based on that presentation about ARD, she decided to seek a master's degree at Penn State to work with Stuart and me. So for 2 years, I have had the honor of working with Kate. And I must say that I love ARD, but I think Kate's really, really onto something with green streets. Bigger challenges, but also enormous potential benefits, as you will shortly hear. But before I turn it over to Kate, I want to give you a brief teaser about my current work. Next slide, please. I'm calling it Artful Rainwater Design, or ARD, Lessons Learned Over Time. Here is what I am doing. I have returned to 20 case studies that appeared in our book, and all of those projects are now 10 to 20 years old. Next. I have interviewed the designers of 17 of those 20 projects, managers of 4 of the projects, and what I call interested parties. They might be campus planners, they might be people who are doing research on the sites linked to 8 of the different projects. Next slide, please, or next. We have new images of 16 of the 17 projects, and the images are quite interesting. The results of all of these interviews and our observations are that I'm formulating a set of benefits and challenges that have been recognized by the ARD creators and managers. Next, please. I also have formulated a draft set of what I call easily digestible axioms for us to keep in mind when we're creating artful rainwater designs, and also some recommendations of things to do and things not to do to ensure future success of our efforts. So this year I'm making some presentations on the work to get some feedback, and I hope to publish it within the next year. Next slide, please. If you're interested in learning any more about my new work, I'd be happy to share that in Q&A or in our office hours. But for now, though, you need to hear about Kate's really great work and consider how it might be applicable to your own efforts. So please, Kate, take it away.
Thanks, Eliza. So I have been inspired by her work since this incredible book came out in 2015. And I've been intrigued by applying a lot of its concepts about visual appeal, cultural acceptance, ecological literacy to the context of the residential yard and how we manage stormwater within the residential yard. Because as you all probably agree, yards communicate a lot of information about us. They're complicated. They communicate what's important to us, what we value, what we see as our relationship with the natural world. But these, the norm of the yard, which is fairly consistent across the US, there are some trends here that you probably recognize. It can have some pretty severe negative impacts on the environment, which some speakers have already elaborated on. You're likely familiar with some alternatives to the norm, which we've also seen at the conference so far. Transforming lawn into pollinator meadows, and the subject of today's presentation, using rain gardens in the residential context. But the challenge in making these types of approaches to pollinator gardens and meadows, to those beautiful multi-layered woodland gardens, is people's attachment to the norm, and also that shift in maintenance that comes with these new approaches. Where some people see a beautiful garden, others will inevitably see a weedy pit. And sometimes that really does happen when maintenance breaks down. So today what I'm going to be talking about specifically is public perception of rain gardens in this type of residential context. And I do think a lot of what I explore here is applicable to these other types of ecological approaches that many of you are doing. So just to back up a little bit, the problem that rain gardens are trying to address is this increase in stormwater runoff caused by a very kind of conventional approach to stormwater management, which is conveying runoff from impervious surfaces, roads, sidewalks, parking lots, lawns, semi-pervious surfaces into storm drains, through pipes, and usually directly into water bodies where they can have a severe impact on stream health. And actually, over 50% of streams assessed in the US are impaired for certain types of ecological uses. And stormwater is certainly a significant contributor to that. So green stormwater infrastructure, abbreviated GSI, is an alternative practice to this conventional approach to stormwater management, using plants, soil systems, permeable pavements, other practices to store, infiltrate, evapotranspirate stormwater. Rain gardens are an example of that. Usually that term is describing these depressions in the landscape that slow, filter, infiltrate runoff. Green streets is a strategy that integrates that into that right-of-way. So that might be between the street and the sidewalk. The rain garden could also be designed as a bump out that goes into the streetscape. There are different approaches, but we're mainly talking here about integrating green infrastructure into the city or town-owned right-of-way, which is done all over Kansas City. So I wanted to bring up a few kind of regulatory points here because this is important context and also shows why these practices are being invested in. So there are some entities, many entities across the US that have to comply with regulations. And there's a federal permitting program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. This is a lot of acronyms in governmental policy that requires large entities with large stormwater systems to get permits, and often integrating green infrastructure can help them meet those permitting requirements. So some cities will kind of collect stormwater in those underground piping systems and discharge that directly into streams. Others will actually combine that with sewage and then treat that at a wastewater treatment plant, which works on a dry day. On a very rainy day, that can overflow into water bodies. That's called a combined sewer. So the separate sewer, abbreviated MS4, the combined sewer, abbreviated CSO, these are just huge stormwater management systems that many city and towns have that are subject to these federal regulations. There are other types of entities that have to comply, like military bases, public college campuses, a lot of publicly funded hospitals. States will have their own regulations that are often more stringent. Anyone who's developing more than an acre of land has to apply for a permit. And also local counties, cities, and towns may have their own strict requirements as well. So the main takeaway here is that this is a lot of opportunity to invention, for intervention. Lots of towns, cities, and other types of entities have to meet stormwater regulations. And a lot of them are using green stormwater infrastructure to do so. As we know in Kansas City, to address its CSO requirements, it also has a separate sewer. And in Montgomery County is another example across the country, halfway across the country, that's dealing with its MS4 permit with green stormwater infrastructure. And it really kind of seems like it might be a benign solution, this green streets concept, and there has been a lot of support for this, absolutely, across the country. But there's also been kind of a surprising amount of resistance. These are news articles from lots of different areas, from East Coast to West Coast. And I was interested in how many comments had to do with appearance and the terms that were being used. There has been some academic research that has looked into public reaction to green street rain gardens. And these terms appear in that also. So kind of a negative reaction to wilderness, or a sense of wilderness. seeing them as ugly, unkempt, overgrown weeds, wild grass, dull. So these are terms that aren't surprising to me as an ecological designer. I've heard of them in other contexts, but I really wanted to take a deep dive. And as a graduate student at Penn State working with Eliza as my advisor, it was a really incredible opportunity to do so. So the first part there was just diving into what research already exists about public reaction to Green Street rain gardens. And through that, kind of 4 general themes emerged. There were concerns about physical safety of people. Are we going to fall into these things? Will they breed mosquitoes, harbor snakes? Will these things work? Will they actually be able to drain, make a difference? Concerns about responsibility, kind of disagreements over who should be responsible for runoff. And then that category of appearance certainly came up frequently in these studies. I decided to focus on that one for this particular study. And a big reason there is that the first 2, I think, can be more addressed through pilot projects, through education. It's a little more straightforward. These latter 2 groups are really complicated and involve values, they involve social norms. It's not an easy, obvious solution. So I designed this study with Eliza that looked at Green Street's projects in 2 very different places, Kansas City and Montgomery County, that are similar in terms of how they've approached green infrastructure as a way to meet permitting requirements and realize other benefits. So they both started these really incredible Green Streets programs in the late 2000s, but they also differ in other ways, demographic ways, in terms of land use, different patterns that you see in the landscape. So I wanted to see, are the public reactions we're seeing in these 2 places consistent, or are they quite different? So to kind of describe the process, my approach was to actually interview the program managers, so the staff working for the city and the county, and to also interview the design consultants that worked on these projects. So these are 2 groups of people that have worked on several projects over the past decade plus in these 2 locations, and have thus encountered the public in many instances and over time. And the 2 research questions were, how do the aesthetic components of the rain gardens installed within residential right-of-ways correlate with different types of public reaction? And then how did the gardens change over time and why? I decided to focus on the residential context, so Green Street's programs in residential neighborhoods, because that seemed to be where a lot of the negative reaction was happening. And my thinking here was that a big issue is that the municipal right-of-way, the edge of that line is not always clear in the landscape. It can extend into people's yards. Sometimes it ends at the road. And even if this is county land and you have a rain garden in that grass verge, often whatever is in front of the house is perceived as a reflection of its owner. And this is a quotation from Montgomery County about some resident reactions. Someone said that the county is trying to convince residents rain gardens in their front yards on the county's right-of-way are a good idea. So they're aware that the rain gardens are on county land, but they perceive that space as part of their front yard. But why would that necessarily be problematic? Well, this kind of requires coming to some general criteria about what the norm, the convention would be in these types of landscapes. And you're probably familiar with some of these. They've been mentioned in other presentations, that uniform short green lawn, exposed mulch between plants. We've heard mulch mentioned a few times, sheared non-native evergreen shrubs, non-native flowering shrubs, those colorful annuals out front. And often anything herbaceous is removed in the wintertime. Maintenance tends to be pretty frequent and involve a lot of inputs. The rain garden looks a lot different. It has a concave form, so it's not the flat lawn, it's not the raised mulch beds. It has these actual infrastructure components, native species that are not typically found in nurseries, planted densely, so you're not seeing a lot of mulch. And you're getting a lot of tall herbaceous vegetation that's often left standing after dormancy for lots of different reasons. And the maintenance is different. You have annual cutbacks of vegetation, monthly weeding, sediment removal. So it's a slightly different approach. But so these two things are different. The norm is different from the rain garden. But even then, why would that in itself be problematic? Difference isn't always, it shouldn't always be a challenging thing. But if we look back to landscape architecture theory and research, there's a lot of ideas here that we can work from that provide some interesting context. So 2 landscape architecture scholars published in the 80s and 90s about this topic, Eliza's piece, which she mentioned, and Joan Nassauer as well. And they both identified these relationships. Eliza's article looked at relationships between that lush green lawn and social values like health, leisure, luxury, between openness, so physically being able to see across the landscape, and these values of transparency and neighborliness. You're not hiding anything. And those visible signs of maintenance, scrupulous maintenance. You can see that these hedges have been trimmed, that this lawn has been mown. Correlations between those things and status, work ethic, civic responsibility. So this kind of pattern language in the landscape has been described as an aesthetic of care. We're interpreting these signs as communicating that these people care about their landscape, they have a social status, they want to be neighborly. And some research that has been done since then confirms a lot of this information and builds on it. So there have been studies showing that people have very different preferences for what happens in the front and backyard. And what they actually like ends up appearing in the backyard. And what appears in the front, a lot of people don't personally like. They just feel compelled to kind of maintain that yard norm. And also studies are showing that people with environmental values use environmentally harmful practices as much as those who do not. So there's this misalignment even then, people who are knowledgeable and what they actually practice in their landscape. So given this context, what strategies can be used in the rain garden to increase acceptance? And this is what this study looked into. So through interviewing those program managers and those designers, 4 key themes emerged. The first, there's aesthetic components and qualities that I mentioned, looking at the relationship between those and those types of social values. Interviewees brought up community engagement strategies, and also reflecting on changes after installation, what they allowed, what they didn't, and what's the intention behind that. So I can't go through all of this in detail, but I will share with you as much as I can in the time that we have together. Looking at that first category of aesthetic components, what you're seeing on the left side of the screen are the traits that the interviewees identified as correlating with a positive public perception of the Green Street Rain Garden. So low herbaceous vegetation, grasses, perennials, 18 inches was a number that was thrown out there. Low shrubs, a controlled, compact growth habit, plants that aren't drooping, species without weed in the name, which is interesting to think about. There's also a point about diversity. So they had kind of a positive reaction to some plant diversity, but a negative reaction to when there was too much, and there might be a sweet spot around 8 species. People like seeing plants familiar to the neighborhood or that they've seen in nurseries. And while people like flowers, they don't like dead seed heads. So the negative public perception category includes a lot of the opposite of what I just mentioned. One interesting note here is kind of this aversion to grass, which I had mentioned was identified in previous research. So too much ornamental grass was really seen as a negative. Another category that was distilled from this research is having some type of defined edge around the rain garden. And that can look like different things. It can be a shoveled edge, could be hardscaped sidewalk. This is a recessed curb that was put in. As long as there's a clear differentiation between what's rain garden and what's not. And when you start to lose that, people are having a negative public reaction. People also seem to appreciate boulders, stone walls, art, water features, benches, little lending libraries, different types of objects that they were familiar to them and that seemed intentional. They didn't like when rain gardens were too deep, or when they could see a lot of infrastructure that seemed very practical, but prompted a kind of negative reaction in their minds. Seasonal characteristics, another category. So they thought the public responded well to some type of year-round visual appeal, whether that's different types of stem colors in the winter, spring bulbs, grasses, herbaceous vegetation, as long as it retains that upright habit. Some folks specifically mentioned a challenge of early spring when there's a lot of warm season grasses in the plant palette. Those are cut back at some point, and this kind of appearance can be a little tricky for some people to appreciate, especially when you get standing water in those gardens. There's also a negative reaction to no visible plant growth. So this is definitely a tricky one, kind of thinking about the seasonality. This is a big category, plant arrangement. So a few things that were mentioned was having familiar garden plants or traditional plants along the outer edges, and kind of those harder working, deep-rooted grasses and perennials and shrubs running down the middle, the center of the rain garden. And what this does is it helps provide some type of pattern of plant arrangement. So the public seemed to appreciate when they could see a pattern, whether that's rows of vegetation, repeated clusters of species, something that seemed obvious versus a seemingly kind of random assortment of plants randomly distributed within the plant bed. They also mention the importance of having vertical distinction between your plant layers, so not having the herbaceous vegetation grow into the shrub or the tree layer. So some of the additional spatial considerations that they mentioned was thinking about having those edgers, those plants along the outer edges that are familiar to people, that might be more compact, they have flowers, and then putting those kind of harder working, very functional grasses and perennials in the bottom area of the rain garden. They also mentioned the importance of paying attention to the inlet, that's where the stormwater enters the rain garden, using sturdy plants there to trap sediment, debris that floats into the curb cut, and filter contaminants there. And so there were some species that seemed to be used frequently in those spaces. So it's kind of interesting to then think about this within the context of research about environmental psychology and kind of the philosophy of aesthetics. And some of the main takeaways here are that people seek a balance between mystery and complexity, and between legibility and coherence. So people kind of want to know, what is this thing that we're looking at? What do I do here? But they're also intrigued by something that's different, that catches their eye, their curiosity. And so environmental psychologists have pointed this out in different types of landscapes, and that definitely seems applicable to the Green Street Rain Garden. Another kind of question that this all prompted for me is, what's the role of signs in the Green Street Rain Garden? Can having a sign explaining its function actually increase people's positive aesthetic reaction to it, or just make them appreciate it for some reason or another? Especially since signs were brought up by the interviewees. And something else this led me to think about is some recent studies in environmental behavior that show how knowledge is not a reliable driver of behavioral change. So there isn't this very straight connection between knowledge that someone has about a certain type of behavior and whether that being an indicator of them changing that behavior. So in other words, relying on knowledge alone probably isn't going to be enough to get people to change their habits, or in this case, to really appreciate and accept the Green Street Rain Garden. So we're looking for kind of needing to combine all of these things, these strategies in the Green Street Rain Garden. And that's a challenge, especially since there seems to be a spectrum of acceptance here where does something become too biodiverse or not biodiverse enough? People had mentioned that there's a sweet spot there. When is there a visible pattern of plant arrangement? When does that go away? There's a lot of nuance in this that affects what designers do in the design process, and then how these things are maintained once they're installed. Theme 2 was really looking at what are those terms that the interviewees were using to describe the positive public reactions that they've encountered. And then what are the words they use to describe those negative traits? So things like floppy plants, not being able to see a noticeable plant arrangement. And looking at those terms, it's pretty obvious that this is about perceived care and perceived neglect in the Green Street Rain Garden. And for those of you who were in Rick Dark's presentation, that's something that he brought up is I think his words were actually how to use cues to show meaning, intention, rather than neglect. And he presented this idea of this beauty strip that he had in front of his property. So this is all translating to the Green Street Rain Garden in very direct ways. One thing that I also was curious about is this aversion to grasses and kind of these mixed herbaceous vegetation communities, especially since this is a plant community that exists across the country. And perhaps in a very natural setting, it's acceptable. We see it as nature and as a positive thing. Perhaps when we see it in a developed area, we don't see it as nature. We see it as something else. And that might have to do with how it's commonly encountered on these vacant properties where the mowing has stopped. You get this kind of emergent early successional vegetation. So what's curious then is to look at what happens to a residential landscape when the maintenance is stopped. You get a lot of traits that do overlap with what's happening in rain gardens sometimes, like a mix of broadleaved and herbaceous, broadleaved and grasses within the lawn. You get things flopping over the edges, plants growing into each other. So that can happen in the rain garden, and it can also happen particularly between maintenance sessions. So this is kind of something to think about here, is that it's not really a stretch to imagine why people might see neglect in the rain garden when they might be connecting some of these traits. Joe Nassauer in the 90s also proposed an approach for dealing with that transition, helping people think about how do we make this acceptable without compromising on the ecological function of these different approaches to landscape design. And she came up with this concept of cues to care, using these visual signs of intention, these familiar signs of intention within a messier ecological system. So the findings that I derived from this study really kind of confirmed what those cues would be in the Green Street Rain Garden. Another finding, something that was mentioned by the interviewees, is the importance of context. So the public has a positive reaction when the materials are something that's found within that residential environment and kind of speaks to the sense of place. And when there's a different material, it can be perceived negatively. And the scale of context matters. So even if there's prairie beyond the city limits, inserting it into that immediate context can still be problematic. So the issue of context can be a very positive thing, but has to be dealt with somewhat delicately. Just to quickly go through a few more findings here. The interviewees from both locations brought up some strategies that they use during the community engagement process that they think are successful in building public support for these Green Street Rain Gardens. And one is really giving residents agency. So giving them a chance to either choose plants or choose from templates, giving them the chance to opt out, which of course is a compromise. They also identified using projects that can realize multiple benefits for residents. So how can a Green Street project include resurfacing, lighting, pole banners, curbing, the drive aprons for people's individual homes, and really pointing out what those benefits are. There's also a trend towards using more realistic renderings. So sometimes as landscape architects, we get a little carried away and present a rendering that might not be communicating what will actually be there and how it'll change throughout the seasons. One finding that was consistent across both places was also how sometimes some green infrastructure elements, like porous concrete, like those warm season grasses, were interpreted as inferior by folks living in environmental justice communities. And so when they see those items, they're interpreting them as a symbol of neglect and perhaps a sign of continued disinvestment in those communities. So prioritizing GSA in those areas actually gets a little bit complicated and really underscores kind of the importance of thinking about those cues to care and those cues to investment. And lastly, how did the rain gardens change over time? How did their appearance change? And how might we think about reacting to that? So interviewees did bring up how some folks would make additions. This is actually in Minnesota. Someone's added some annuals here. And kind of the pros and cons of letting people do that. Some cities are actively recruiting residents to take ownership and adopt a Green Street rain garden and get involved in maintenance. But the task of maintenance itself is, of course, complicated, as other speakers have brought up. And they had some advice for designers who are working on these projects, different ideas for designing that will help maintenance down the road. One thing they mentioned was specifying high-grade plants instead of restoration-grade plants, at least for those edgers, those plants along the outer edges of the rain garden. Using a more simplified plant palette, not getting too crazy with the number of species in the garden, planting in clusters. So this helps maintenance crews with plant identification. And it also helps with ease when these plants are grouped when they have similar plant requirements, maintenance requirements. Using dwarf cultivars and using hardscape to provide some structure between maintenance sessions. They also brought up the importance of developing an establishment spec for the first 1 to 3 years of the Green Street Rain Garden's life. And then additionally, a long-term maintenance plan, because it'll look different. It requires different types of interventions and different frequencies. And this is a quotation from one of the people I spoke with. The maintenance crews are used to gray infrastructure. So those underground pipes. And gray infrastructure is strongest on day one. And then it slowly starts to decrease in strength and perhaps one day collapse. Green infrastructure is the opposite. It's weakest on day one and really needs a lot of weeding, perhaps some adaptive management to swap out plants that aren't doing so well. It needs more work until that plant community really fills in and those root systems start to function. So there's really kind of a lot to unpack here in maintenance, but I would like to give folks some time for questions. One kind of way that I want to wrap up this is this question of, is it worth it? So if we reflect on these findings, it seems like we're asking so much of the garden. We want it to withstand some difficult physical conditions. It has to be flooded, needs to be drought tolerant. That's even more of the time. Salt, heat, up here, snow. It has to demonstrate care to gain acceptance, respond to context, be designed using a participatory process, and be regularly maintained. So is it worth the investment? And through talking with people, a few key themes emerged. And one is this opportunity to really improve environmental literacy. When these kind of ecological features are integrated as part of this really personal landscape, the residential context, it really can ground people and connect them within the watershed and also connect them with each other. And that's that social infrastructure piece. And it's this concept of using the streetscape as more than just this means of transportation, this ways of getting from point A to point B, and really making it a place for ecology, for beauty, for community connection. But we do need to think about how we're designing them in order to build public support and to sustain it over time. And I'd really like to uplift and center the work of those that I interviewed for this project. So these are, again, those municipal program managers and designers in both Kansas City and Montgomery County. These are their findings that I'm interpreting through this lens of history and theory and other research. So I definitely recommend that you check out. Both of them have websites with lots of information. Hopefully some are on this call. I'd love to hear from you. And something else I've been recently putting together is a plant list for different areas of the rain garden. So for the inlet, the bottom of the rain garden, the sides, then those edgers around the outer edge of that. And I can make this available as a PDF. I'll make sure that the conference organizers post this in a place for you. It's just a start, and it's based on these interviews and also resources found across the country, which I've included on another slide. So I think we can probably wrap up now, and hopefully we have some questions. I don't know how many people are out there. I actually can't see. So hopefully someone's out there and has a question. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful. And Eliza. I'm not seeing any questions. I have questions, but so I invite anybody who's watching. I know I popped over to the other platform and saw that there was 15 or 20 people watching. So go ahead and speak up, and I will tell you that they have office hours later if you need to come back and have a more face-to-face conversation there. I'll get it started with, I was thinking as you're talking about how people perceive things and thinking of politics and political ads of this kind of idea of who's with us, who's against us, and is something threatening? Am I aggrieved? And all of those things feeding into more of an emotional response. So I'm wondering if your research touches on how do certain landscapes make people feel emotionally?
That is a really good question. So a lot of this concept of neglect is tied to emotions. So it's that sense of personal failure. It's a sense of failure as what it means to be a resident of this country, to be a homeowner. So I think there's a lot that's built in. It's not something that I explored deeply in this particular study, but I think that underlies that whole reaction behind neglect and behind care. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Eliza, based on your...
I'll just say a little bit, which is that as everyone involved in this knows, the great irony is, as Kate said, the perception of neglect in the landscape and the perception of failure, personal failure or otherwise, maybe it's municipal failure. How could they do this to us, right? The irony is that the public's perception of care, which is the neat and tidy landscape, is actually the antithesis, as everyone here knows, of environmentally responsible care. So this is really tricky stuff because, as you point out, Chris, it is quite emotional. How do we, again, I'll use my favorite term, move the needle in that regard? This is not easy. I was afraid, Chris, that you were going to go down the path of red landscapes and blue landscapes, which is another issue.
I have been thinking about that too, yes.
But it's tricky stuff. Tricky stuff.
We have another question from Jennifer, who asks, she says, thanks very much for your time. I'm wondering how the acceptance spectrum relates to the effectiveness of the rain garden bioswale. So translating that.
It's a really great question. I think the key criteria for plants in the Green Street Rain Garden is having those deep roots, because the magic really has to do with infiltration and the breakup of a lot of those contaminants that's coming in with the stormwater. A lot of that happens in the soil with this interaction between roots and the soil media. And certainly part of that physically slowing down water on the surface is also important. And that's why grasses are so effective here, and a lot of perennials too, is they can withstand those flows and catch water. So anytime you take away from that, it does become problematic. And I think that it really is the argument behind having those functional plants in the bottom of the rain garden, the lowest elevation, where water is sitting, it's moving, it's infiltrating. And then having these plants that also thrive in these conditions and are also contributing something to infiltration, to stabilizing the banks of the rain garden. Having those along the upper outer edges and using plants there that kind of meet the acceptance criteria. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Jennifer, but it would be neat to visualize that in the same way that I visualize the acceptance spectrum.
I have a slightly different response, which is sometimes the effectiveness of the facility, the green infrastructure, diametrically opposes the aesthetic preference. And I'll use one simple example, deposition of sediment, right? Deposition of sediment is a good thing. That means that it's actually working. We're not allowing those chemicals and detritus and all that junk to go into the water system. But we then have to have a way to maintain the facilities so that we remove the sediments. And it's got to be easy for the maintenance crews to be able to do that. So if someone sees, Stuart and I do this all the time, we walk around looking at rain gardens and all kinds of facilities, and we see sediment and we say, yay, oh, because it's both good and not so good. We have to get rid of it. So it's a really interesting question to look at aesthetic acceptance versus the actual functioning of the facility.
Yeah.
And when you dig that sediment out, are you disturbing roots, or can you design it in such a way with a forebay of some sort that is almost like a plant-free area where you can just scrape that out as needed?
Yes, that is that. And Stuart and I have designed a million of these on napkins, an easy way to scoop it out. But yes, the plant-free zone. Yeah.
One thing that I've been trying to say to people is that the aesthetic of tidiness is killing our environment, or it strikes again when my planting gets mowed down, and that an aesthetic of ecological function would be more valuable. Does that exist in other cultures or at other times, an aesthetic of ecological function?
Yeah.
Well, Chris, I have intentionally to date limited my research to the United States, specifically because there are different aesthetic expectations in different countries. So for example, I find that in Germany and in Germanic countries in general, people have a tendency, at least in my findings, to be more tolerant of a somewhat messy landscape. Americans are, but the visions and the values at work are so different culture to culture, country to country, that I'm not ready to go beyond the US right now.
Same. I think there are so many different perspectives on this, why there's an urgency with climate change and with the increasing storms that we're already seeing in cities. There's a need here, and people should just get used to it. They should just get used to the wild, and we shouldn't try to cater to this their concerns about aesthetics. And I do hear that. But I also have heard from a lot of folks working in this space that in order for the projects to work, to physically be there and not be dug out, to not be sabotaged, we have to meet people halfway, or at least, 3/4 of the way. And I think they've presented some really concrete ways to do that.
A follow-up question from Jennifer, who's coming to us from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Can you provide an example of what an educational sign in a garden might say to help people understand that the bed is not neglected when they're seed heads? I'm thinking of the benefits of goldfinches actually feed their babies with seeds, and most people would know that, and I didn't know that until recently.
I have actually seen signs that say this is not a neglected space. I have seen that, and experimenting with saying this is a space that's cared for people that are doing the whole no mow May concept, that have let their lawn grow tall for the month of May and have put signs out that say, I have not neglected my lawn. I'm just leaving this here for pollinators. So I think that's one strategy, is saying how it is, and also just trying to make it relevant to what people are interested in. That's a big part of what comes out of this environmental behavior research, is getting to know who your audience is and then speaking to that. So if you're in a community and people are really into birding, then maybe that's something you focus on. If they're really concerned about water quality because their local industry relies on fishing and outdoor recreation, maybe that's something you focus on. But trying to make it relevant to people's lives, I think, is what I would say about approaching signs and experimenting with it.
Jennifer, I'm so excited that you asked that question, because Kate's 100% right. We, in our arboretum here at Penn State, we have some snags. They are dead trees that are held up with concrete structures. And it's so funny because people at first were horrified. What are these dead trees doing in this landscape? Now there's signage that explains the importance of these snags within our bird garden in particular. But one thing I will say about signage, and I feel really strongly about this, it is much better to have signage, multiple signs that give you just a tidbit of information, rather than a sign that looks like, as I characterize it, a lecture in the landscape, all that text that you're never going to stand there and read. So giving people, as Kate said, snippets of information that are relevant to their interests. These seed heads are really important. We're leaving them here for the birds, right? Or whatever it might be. And by catering to their interests, to see the benefits to things that would interest them, then automatically you are communicating the fact that this is not a neglected landscape. So great question. Have at it. Good luck.
Don't see any new questions right now, so maybe this is a good time to wrap it up. The one last thing I had on my notes was high-grade plants. Is that cultivars?
No, it's not cultivars, but there's, in the nursery industry, there are different grades assigned to plant species. And so for a lot of these big, large-scale projects, often the specification is for lower grade plants. They're a lot cheaper. They're propagated in a very different way. And in the type of landscape that's on an edge where you're doing a wetland restoration project, those plants are perfect because they don't have to look a certain way. They can fit that context. But in this, the Green Street Rain Garden is actually very highly visible, and its scale is quite small. So I think that's what they're getting there, is it doesn't have to necessarily be a cultivar, but especially with where shrubs are concerned, you want to get a higher grade plant from the nursery itself. And cultivars were definitely brought up. People mentioned specific cultivars because they can be more compact. They can have different types of foliage that are more attractive at different times of the year. So that's something that they definitely brought up.
Very good. Well, thank you again, both of you. I think this was wonderful. We have about 4 minutes. Your office hours are starting, so I'd invite anybody else to go over to that session, and they can join you there to ask any more questions that they have.
Sounds
Thank you,
good.
Chris, and thanks
Yeah,
everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone out in the void. Hopefully I'll see some of you soon. All right, I'm going to find the Zoom link.